We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. I am your moderator for today, Lyndsey Smith. I am a field editor with Real Agriculture. Real Agriculture is based out of Lethbridge, Alberta, and I'm joining you today from Ottawa, Ontario. Before we begin, just a quick reminder to all that we will have a wonderful Q&A session at the end of the presentations today. So as you watch today's guests and their presentation, please make sure that you enter your detailed questions in the Q&A, and we'll tackle those near the end of the session. So this session is Best for Who? Farming and Management Best Practices, brought to you, of course, by the School of Public Policy's Simpson Centre for Agriculture and Food Innovation and Public Education. So joining us today, we have two guests. We have Jonathan Verschuuren, I tried, joining us from the Netherlands, and now he is a professor of international and EU environmental law from Tilburg University. And we have Sarah van Wyngaarden with agriculture and resource economics at the University of Alberta, joining us from Edmonton. So today, our panelists will discuss Alberta's current policies, programs and adoption rates, and compare them to legislation in Australia, parts of Europe, and we'll understand how uptake of policies works, and sometimes with conflicting interests with farmers and ranchers here in Canada and around the world. So I've had a tiny sneak peek at what we're going to hear today, and it's pretty fascinating, very thought-provoking. So of course, please, as I mentioned, as you're watching today and listening, please formulate those questions and put them in the Q&A. How this is going to work today, so we're going to hear from Jonathan first, and then we'll hear from Sarah. They've each got about a 10 to 15 minute presentation, at which time, once those are both done, we'll have a moderated discussion between the two presenters, and then we'll make our way to the questions. So with that, I will introduce Jonathan. Jonathan, if you would like to share your screen and take it away with your presentation. And I hope I didn't butcher your name too badly. I really did try.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Yes, you had a perfect pronunciation of my name, Jonathan Verschuuren. I'm a professor of international European environmental law, and so I'm a lawyer. So my presentation also will focus on the law and policy. And the background for my presentation is basically two projects that I have done or I'm still doing. First, a couple of years ago, I went to Australia and did an evaluation of the carbon farming legislation that they have in place, which already exists since 2011. So there's really nice lessons to be drawn from their experiences. And at the moment, we are doing a project, me and my colleagues, on whether and how we can integrate agricultural greenhouse gas emissions into the European emissions trading system. Again, we will look at some of the experiences in Australia, but also experiences in the USA and in Canada, because in Canada also, in several provinces, there is a link to agriculture in the ETS. So before going to the law and the policy, I would like to just share a little bit of the background, but I think this is broadly familiar with most of you. Three things that you have to keep in mind, three issues that we have to deal with and that we want to tackle through legal or regulatory intervention. First of all, as we all know, agriculture contributes to climate change. So about a quarter of all the greenhouse gas emissions are associated to agriculture or to food. The latest figures indicate even about 30%. And this is mostly non-CO2 emissions, methane and nitrous oxide, largely connected to livestock, but also CO2 emissions from peatland drainage and deforestation connected to agriculture. This, of course, is mainly happening in developing countries, the deforestation link. At the same time, of course, agriculture also is an important source of sequestration. So it also is part of the solution, because agricultural soils and vegetation on agricultural land can take up a lot of CO2 from the atmosphere. Then second background information is that agriculture also suffers heavily from climate change. We know from IPCC reports that there will be negative yield impacts for all major crops in large parts of the world. And that is especially worrying because we also have, that's the third background information that is relevant, we also are witnessing a large increase in food demand over the coming decades until 2050 due to population growth and to greater affluence in large parts of the world, especially in countries like China and India. So there's an increasing demand for food. And we already know now that if we continue on the current pathway in how we produce that food, then we will have lots of issues, not only with greenhouse gas emissions that will increase sharply, but also because we do not have sufficient space to grow all the food that we need, especially if we use the animal interface that we have now in our food. So this is the kind of the background. Now, of course, we have also kinds of solutions. We have all kinds of technological solutions. Methane capture is more and more used in livestock keeping. Precision agriculture is also increasingly being applied. Cultured meat is gaining ground in production of meat. And of course, there are many behavioral changes that have a positive impact on the climate: agroforestry, organic farming, crop rotation, soil carbon sequestration. Most of these agricultural practices also have beneficial impacts on climate change adaptation. And they also often lead to higher food production. So these are typically examples of climate-smart agriculture, where both mitigation and adaptation and increased food production needs are met. This is a slide that I took from the IPCC report on climate change and land. It's not very well readable. I think it's just to indicate that there's a huge amount of food system response options that are considered to be useful both for mitigation and adaptation in the food industry and in agriculture. So there's a lot of things that we can do to solve the problem that we are discussing. The previous one focuses on the food system as such. This slide focuses more on consumption, the consumer, because also changes with the consumer can have a big impact on climate change. And I think, well, it's pretty self-evident. Okay, then let's move to the law. So in Australia, they have a system which makes it possible for farmers to propose projects that lead to either emission avoidance or increased sequestration on farmland. These projects, when they follow preset methodology and are accepted by the government, lead to greenhouse gas emission reduction, and the farmer can get credits for these projects that then are being bought up by the authorities. So this is a way to make money for farmers. And well, as I said, I did an evaluation of this system, and the outcome is pretty positive. It's from a legal point of view and a regulatory point of view, it's quite a complex system. Hundreds of pages of legal texts on methodologies, on all kinds of rules that exist. But thanks to these rules, it appears that the system works quite well. A lot of rules, of course, are on monitoring and reporting, because this system is part of climate change policy, which means that the authorities have to make sure that emissions that were reduced, or the amount of CO2 that was sequestered, actually were sequestered, and not just for a short period of time, but for a long period of time. So you want the CO2 that has been taken out of the atmosphere to remain in the soil or in the vegetation for at least 100 years, for instance. So those are all kinds of rules that exist to make sure that these projects lead to additional measurable and verifiable emission cuts. This slide shows the methodologies that exist. So it's a wide range of methodologies that is used. All kinds of farming sectors are addressed or have the option to have projects under this system. I will not read them out loud. You can read this slide for yourself. And as I said, it's pretty successful, especially after 2015, because that was the moment where there was a change of policy. And from that moment on, the government started to buy up these carbon credits. So it was no longer the private carbon market that had to be addressed or had to be sought after by these farmers. They knew upfront what they would get, and there was a reliable source of funding, namely government funding. That led to the stability and the legal certainty that farmers were looking for. A lot of farmers participated, although it was mainly large farmers, I must say. We'll come back to that later. So large farmers did projects and earned money under this system. And what was interesting is that for me, I basically looked at the legal framework. That legal framework is very robust, ensures integrity. Everybody whom I interviewed agreed to that. This system led to real reductions, also to additional reductions, and there was a high level of compliance. And what was interesting is that those projects that led to co-benefits, especially in the area of adaptation, were most popular with the farmers. So most farmers that were actually, of course, they were interested in the money that they could make with these projects, but they were especially interested in those projects that had a broader benefit from them. Also, benefit like more resilient soil, more healthy soil. More biodiversity on their land. Those kind of things were equally important for a lot of farmers. There are also some things that still were missing. As I said, mainly large farms were involved, and the majority of farms, like in most countries, is actually a small family farm. For them, this was too complex, with too much overhead costs, too difficult to carry out. So this is one of the issues that you have to think of when developing a system like this. There were all kinds of attempts to make this easier, for instance, aggregation, so that small farmers could work together and together do one project, but that had all kinds of problems, so that didn't really work out, it didn't really emerge. And the high overhead costs were considered to be a problem for everybody. So in practice, consultants played a very big role. Consultants, so-called carbon agents, were actually the big stakeholder group that was very active in this field. They were the ones that proposed and developed projects for farmers. They were the ones that did all the monitoring and organized all of that and did organize all the reporting. And they, of course, in return also got a large part of the funding. So this is something to keep into mind as well when expanding a system like this to other countries as well. And it was also clear that that if you really want to roll this out on a very broad scale across the country, including all farms or majority of the farms, then you need a lot of funding. Well, then the EU, so my background is EU law, and I'm especially interested in how can we change current EU legislation that is focused on farmers to also to help them and stimulate them to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to take adaptation measures. And it's a little bit complex, so I will keep it very brief, just the highlights. So at the moment, agricultural emissions are not really regulated. We have an effort share regulation which covers all emissions that are not covered by the emissions trading system. and agriculture emissions fall under that, but there are no specific goals for agriculture under that regulation. So it's basically not regulated there. LULUCF emissions, so those are emissions from cropland and grassland, land use and land use change and forestry emissions. Those are regulated, but this is a relatively limited amount of greenhouse gas emissions. The Common Agriculture Policy is an income support tool for farmers, an income support system. Farmers can apply for subsidies under this program, and there's a possibility to apply for subsidies for climate change related projects. I'm not going to go into detail, you just have to know that it exists. Well, all of this has been evaluated a couple of times by different institutes and also government bodies of the EU, and it's clear that it's not working. So the effort sharing regulation, LULUCF rules, do not really lead to many changes in the field. And the Common Agriculture Policy, although it focuses quite a lot on climate change already, in practice doesn't work either, simply because farmers don't apply for funds under these headings of climate change. So climate change projects are not submitted. We have rules that are not really aligned with climate change policy. So for instance, you can, if you do a climate change related project under the CAP, you only have to do this project for 1 to 5 years and then you get funded. But when you decide after, let's say, 5 years to cut all the trees again and to just remove everything that you planted, that sequestered all the CO2, then that's not a problem. But of course, from climate change policy, that is a problem because you need to sequester the carbon for a much longer period of time. So basically, the non-alignment between the CAP and the climate change requirements is one of the issues. And this was confirmed very recently by the European Court of Auditors, who they checked how much money has been spent under the CAP to climate change related actions. That is 100 billion euros. How much greenhouse gas emission cuts were achieved by that? 0. So this is a clear indication that this does not work. Well, things seem to be changing. We have a new policy in place, the European Green Deal, since 2019, with the aim to be carbon neutral in 2050. That new policy explicitly also focuses on agriculture. And at the same time, there also is a new agriculture policy called Farm to Fork Strategy, which focuses on a fair, healthy, and environmentally friendly food system, also including then climate change, of course. And so far, there has been one legislative proposal that has just been published. The LULUCF regulation will be amended to also include non-CO2 emissions from agriculture, so also methane emissions from cattle. That is a huge change, but this change will only take effect as of 2031, so still 10 years to go. And it's completely unclear at the moment what this exactly means. How are they going to monitor and report, and how are you going to measure methane emissions and things like that. So this still needs to be developed further. This means that other instruments need to be developed as well. One proposal is, of course, to reform the CAP and to align it more with climate change policies. There are some plans to do that. So a bigger budget will become available to climate change measures. But at the same time, there's also more room for member states to develop their own policies under the Common Agriculture Policy, under the CAP, which usually is not a good idea because member states often take as much space as possible for their own farmers to make life as easy as possible for them. So I'm not too positive about these changes. Another option, and this is the one that we are researching, is to use the ETS. The ETS in Europe is quite a successful instrument. It has led to huge emission cuts in industry and in energy production. So it would be a good idea to link this to agriculture. And one way to do it is to allow offsets projects, on-farm offset projects that can be funded by regulated entities under the ETS. So industries, energy producers can finance projects with farmers and then get allowances that are tradable under the ETS. This would be a way to finance climate smart agriculture projects with farms. It's also possible that a separate carbon farming instrument will be developed. This is what is at the moment suggested by the European Commission, but we still have no idea what exactly will be the outcome. It is has been announced that by the end of 2021 there will be further proposals. Hopefully, they will also wait for our project, because otherwise we will be too late. So this is targeting the farmers. I think it's also important to also target consumers, because you have to make it attractive also for farmers to change their production, to even to move into other forms of farming. But then there has to be a market, a real market. And there are a lot of instruments that can be used there as well. A meat tax has been proposed a lot. Some countries already have a meat tax, but subsidies for cultured meat or for plant-based alternatives as an option. But you probably also need social media and more soft instruments to make these changes happen with the consumers. Personally, I'm very positive about what's happening with cultured meat. This requires less changes with dietary preferences with the consumer, but has a huge impact on the environment in the sense that we can produce meat without having livestock, which will, if you think about what this means for the planet as a whole, the space that we then suddenly have left that we can do other things with, it's quite amazing if you think about these things. Well, that's what I would like to say as part of my introduction, and I'm happy to take questions later.
All right, thank you, Jonathan. All right, so we are going to go to Sarah's presentation now without having a Q&A now. So right now, especially with that last slide, I jotted down several questions that came up out of that one. So please, I do see some questions coming into the Q&A, so please make sure you put them there. Of course, you can wait, but as things are brought up in these presentations, please put your detailed questions in the Q&A. All right, with that, Sarah, I'll hand it over to you.
Perfect. All right. Hopefully my screen is showing, but I'm going to be focusing mostly on agri-environmental policy as it pertains to Canada as well as Alberta. And then the second half of my presentation, I'm going to provide a very brief and general overview of best management practice adoption and how it pertains to the province of Alberta. I just recently completed my master's in agriculture and resource economics at the University of Alberta. And my thesis was on this topic, and I worked with Dr. Sven Anders and Dr. Peter Boxall. So unlike other developed nations, the Canadian agri-environmental policy is relatively nuanced, with the first national agricultural policy framework being developed in 2003. This began what is now 5-year funding and program agreements amongst governments at the federal, provincial, and territorial levels. Currently, there have been 4 agricultural policy frameworks, with the most recent one being the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, which began in 2018 and will end in 2023. A program that's been common amongst all APFs to date are environmental stewardship programs, and these aim to reduce environmental impacts that stem from agricultural production. To achieve these environmental goals, the frameworks and the programs rely on subsidizing the adoption of voluntary best management practices, and this is typically through a cost share approach. According to the Government of Alberta, the best management practices can be described as voluntary management practices that reduce or eliminate environmental risks while contributing to a farm's sustainability, economic viability, and overall environmental health. The very first agricultural policy framework was very generalizable to Canada and was accessible for all producers across Canada to apply. To provide some context, the very first APF had 5 programs, which were designed to complement one another, beginning with the completion of the Environmental Farm Planning Program, or what's now called the Environmental Farm Plan, or EFP. And this served as an eligibility requirement for producers to participate in the remaining programs under the Environmental Stewardship Program. The EFP can be defined as a voluntary whole farm self-assessment tool that helps producers identify environmental risks on their farm. So what happens is producers basically self-identify risks on a scale from 1, which is low or no risk, to 4, which is high risk or concern. And producers who indicate a score of 3 or 4 must develop individual plans that will help mitigate the risks on their farm. And this is generally through the implementation of best management practices. And the EFP over time has remained an eligibility requirement across all APFs and all environmental stewardship programs. Only in 2013, when Growing Forward 2 was implemented, this was when provinces and territories were finally permitted to develop their own suite of cost-shared programs to target their own environmental needs and circumstances. So skipping forward to the current APF, the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, or CAP, this is a 5-year, $3 billion joint investment between the federal, provincial, and territorial governments. And specific to the province of Alberta, they enacted the Environmental Stewardship and Climate Change Producer Program. And this program is meant to help producers in assessing environmental risks on their land and to mitigate these risks through implementing BMPs. This again is a cost share program that ranges between 30 to 50%, which is lower than prior policies, which were roughly 30 to 70%. It also requires, as stated previously, a valid and completed environmental farm plan, and funding maximums are up to about 100,000. There are some exceptions that go above 100,000, and the minimum funding was around $10,000. So on the screen, I have one of the categories or one of the risk areas under this climate ESCC program. And this is the riparian management sector. As we can see under projects, these are 5 BMPs that producers can apply for, and the funding maximums range between $10,000 to $100,000. So for example, let's say that a producer wants to apply to adopt riparian area fencing. They would be faced with a funding maximum of $75,000, and they would be eligible for cost shares between 30 to 50%. And this is only decided after a producer applies. It should also be noted that the ESCC program is first come, first serve. So if producers, if there's an abundance of producers applying and all the program funding runs out in the first year, that's it. Throughout the rest of the 5 years, there's no more funding available. And also producer applications can be rejected. There's also a suite of eligible and ineligible costs. For this BMP, eligible costs include permanent fencing or electric fencing systems, and ineligible costs are usually materials that are on hand or repair and maintenance long-term. So like most policies, these APFs are not subject to their fair share, are not only just subject to their fair share of criticisms. After the completion of the first APF in 2008, the Auditor General of Canada criticized the policy for its inability to determine to what extent environmental stewardship programs reduced or mitigated environmental risks. This included whether or not producers actually utilized the funding towards best management practice adoption, and if they did they continue these BMPs long term? This criticism has remained consistent across each framework to date, as there's a lack of comprehensive, reliable, and empirical data and information to determine program efficiencies across APFs. This inability to ascertain program efficiency means that currently we are unaware whether these cost share programs are enough to incentivize management changes, or if they even reduce the financial barriers that's come from adopting certain BMPs. The second criticism is the requirement of the environmental farm plan. According to the 2017 Farm Management Survey, a federal survey administered by Statistics Canada every 5 years, in 2017, only 40% of Canadians had an EFP, with only 25% of Albertan producers having completed an EFP. This now means that there is a large pool of producers who are not eligible for cost share funding that is specifically meant to help and encourage producers to adopt best management practices. Lastly, another criticism that was raised by Dr. Peter Boxall in his presidential address in 2018 was that these ESCC programs or environmental stewardship programs are activity-based measures instead of performance-based. And this means that there's no obligation for BMP adoption or stewardship, and performance and actions are not factored into cost share funding, meaning that these cost shares might be not cost effective. So how do these policies compare internationally to the US and the EU? I know that Jonathan touched on some shortcomings of EU policy. However, unlike Canadian framework, the European Union and the United States have grown to actively link producer support programs to environmental conservation and agricultural productivity by using the likes of cross-compliance and payment schemes. The use of cross-compliance allows for developing performance standards that are tied to payments and can be used to target sensitive environmental areas. These two policies also differ in the way that they use cross-compliance. For example, the United States relies much more heavily on penalties. For example, under their Conservation Reserve Program, farmers have to compete for contract renewal, and they're only eligible to compete for contract renewal if they met all the terms in their initial contract, such as a minimum environmental standard of care. In the EU, they use much more extensive monitoring. For example, they have output-based indicators that monitor greening payments, and they also have, sorry, my screen just froze. And they also, have result-based indicators, basically that monitor land under these payments to ensure producers meet environmental standards. In general, compared to Canadian policies, the US and EU have been able to extensively monitor the performance of environmental quality procured from their stewardship programs. And they've also been able to make necessary changes because of their monitoring and reporting to improve the efficiency of their policies and programs over time. All right, so I've talked about some of the downsides of the APF so far, but what I want to focus on now is our producers in Alberta actually adopting any best management practices. So there is really no universal list of BMPs, and even interprovincially in Canada, the BMPs vary quite drastically. For example, the IPCC states that these practices rely on climate, emphatic, social setting, and historical patterns of land use and management. Thankfully, however, in Alberta, we have what's known as the Environmentally Sustainable Agricultural Tracking Survey, which is a biannual survey that tracks 39 best management practices across 8 agri-environmental risk areas. And in my work with Sven and Peter, we develop an adoption score index, which is equivalent to the number of practices adopted for risk area J and farmer F, divided by the number of practices eligible for in risk area J for farmer F. So for example, one of the risk areas is soil conservation, and producers in the survey are asked, do they have crop production in their farmed acres? If a producer answers yes, then they are eligible for all practices, which is 3 practices for soil conservation, and they will receive a score from there. If they answered no, producers are not eligible for any practices, and they will not receive a soil conservation score. In the lower figure, this is an example of a producer who is eligible for all practices as they have crop production on their farm. And this is showing that they adopted 2 out of the 3 plausible BMPs. This would mean that their score is 67%. So this slide, I just wanted to quickly go over the trend of adoption to date across agri-environmental risk areas. And this is from 2012 to 2018. General practices, I summarized the general practice risk area with agricultural waste management. That's why there's only 7 agri-environmental risk areas on the screen. And as we can see, some of the highest adopted areas are water quality and wildlife and conservation. This most likely can be linked to the nature of Alberta's stewardship program since 2013, which have mainly focused on wetland conservation, as well as additional support programs available in Alberta, such as Ducks Unlimited, which provides technical expertise as well as basically funding for wetland and habitat conservation BMPs. Livestock intensive BMPs and risk areas, such as management and grazing management, also have quite high adoption scores. This may be reflective of Alberta's agricultural industry, which is quite livestock intensive. To give some context, Alberta holds 41.6% of national feeder cattle, 59.6% of all feeder cattle and 41.6% of all national cattle herd. Many livestock producers in Alberta are also subject to high environmental standards, especially with what's now known as sustainable sourcing standards. An example of this is Dairy Farmers of Canada. Their Pro-Action Plan requires producers to have an environmental farm plan, and they also have extensive monitoring systems in place to ensure there's a degree of environmental quality and livestock care. And one way to overcome these regulations would be the adoption of best management practices. The lowest scores are under soil conservation and energy and climate change. One possibility is that these risk areas have BMPs that have high uptake costs or long-term maintenance costs, but something that is more likely is that stewardship programs so far are not properly targeting these risk areas or allotting a certain degree of cost shares towards these BMPs, which may have resulted in lower adoption. So I am running out of time, but the very last slide, I just wanted to show the highest and lowest adoption scores for certain practices. Under the least adopted practices, most of these practices have high uptake or long-term maintenance costs, or such as participating in carbon trading. This is a very complex system, as Jonathan stated, And in Alberta, it's relatively new, and a lot of farmers are unaware that the system exists. And it's also more so commercial farmers that apply compared to small farmers. And the most adopted practices generally are those that don't cost a lot or have very little time commitment, such as avoiding draining or filling natural wetlands and sloughs. Right, and that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
All right, thank you so much, Sarah. All right, so now we will go to our moderated discussion between our two presenters. And while they are discussing these points, while I walk us through some of these points and questions, please, as some of you have done already, just add those questions into the chat. We'll give ourselves a solid 15 minutes or so at the end of this webinar to tackle all of your questions. So fantastic overview. Thanks to both of you. I think my overarching sort of thought right now is complex in that realistically, we definitely have, we have different countries, all trying to tackle the same problem, but with incredibly different approaches, and perhaps just in a different part of their journey onto some of these things. So this is certainly very interesting to see where Canada and Alberta specifically sort of measures up. So I do want to talk about, well, several different things. One of the things, let's start with you, Jonathan. I think it's perhaps a very provocative statement to say that, a meat tax or a dairy tax is inevitable. Why do you say that?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that what's similar, I think, in the countries that we just discussed, and also EU and Australia and I think Canada, is that so far we have tried to stimulate farmers to adopt certain practices by rewarding them in a financial way. I think all the systems are, in that sense, the same. We have done that for some time, and I was indeed not very positive about the way this happens in the EU under the Common Agriculture Policy, but I only focused on climate change because we also have another cap, our cap, we both have a cap. You have a Canadian Agricultural Partnership, we have a Common Agriculture Policy. We have already for a long time all kinds of environmental measures that work quite well, also in the area of habitat protection and species protection, things like that. So that works quite well, but if you focus specifically on climate change related measures, then the system doesn't work. And yeah, the reason why I have doubts whether this is the only way forward is that time is running up. Now we are all scientists, climate scientists, say that by 2030 we should be going down really rapidly with our emissions, but so far emissions are increasing still. This is only 8 years away. So things have to change. And that is why I think that we really need a much more aggressive regulatory intervention and not rely on one instrument alone. I think we need a lot of different instruments. In fact, all instruments we have, and we need to target all stakeholders. Otherwise, we won't get the drastic change that is necessary in the short amount of time that we still have.
And so if we look at something like, because I think one of the things that we see in this is cost, right? So what both of your presentations have hit on is that one of the major barriers to widespread adoption or perhaps targeted adoption often comes down to either ongoing costs or the cost of adoption. And so we, both of you have identified that, there has to be some way to fund this. There has to be, yes, maybe there's a stick, but there's got to be a carrot, and there has to be money here, either in an exchange or through subsidies, those sorts of things that has to happen. So where do you think, so I'll put this to both of you, but where do you think then might be some of the best places, either government or public funds or a combination of the two, should really be targeted? Sarah, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure. So when it comes to, I'm more so familiar with Alberta policy, and because the program or the policies right now are very much at the provincial level as they develop their own system. The funding, I think so far when it comes to Canada, because we can't determine the efficiency of the programs, it seems that cost share funding is enough as of right now. It's just we're not targeting environmental risk areas properly, or at least we can't determine if we are because we have really no indication. So as of right now, it's kind of a complex question to answer because we don't have any real ability to determine whether or not we're being cost effective, whether or not we have enough financial incentives, because not all producers apply to these environmental stewardship programs. For example, one of the Statistics Canada survey said that only 4 in 10 producers receive funding from these applications. So I think it's maybe more so a problem of awareness of these programs and maybe even just the application process, not necessarily the funding.
I want to come back to that because I actually have applied for some of this funding. And so I can answer, at least from my perspective, some of those things, because I think you've hit on probably several of these. But Jonathan, I'll put it to you, of course, where then, and especially, looking at the EU, the Australian system, where do you think targeting funding has been effective?
I think funding has been effective, but it's only part of the answer. So one of the problems that we saw in Australia is that for small family farms, people are so busy with their day-to-day work that they don't have time to apply for these kind of things, even to read or to understand or to think about these kind of projects. They are just in this, on this path of just trying to make a living, and it's a hard job. So they also need assistance, and that's also, I think, where the money should go. So people should be appointed to take this out of their hands and to develop these projects and to instruct them. Big farms, I'm not too worried about them because they have staff, they have a lot of people who they can send to courses, and they have also funding often available. They know how to apply, they can hire consultants. But it's the small family farms, and that's the majority of the farms throughout the world, actually, that we have to get on board. And for that, you need all kinds of funding. So the subsidy systems, I think, are great, but they should be tailored more towards climate change, so that we have the same focus and that we all are going the same direction. But you also need other types of financing, and you need to create a market, because you cannot expect farmers just to change the whole market by changing their supply. You have to also change the demand. So I think this will be a very costly policy area for the government, because they have to work on all these areas, but they can also gain money. So that's why the ETS is interesting. All the CO2 emitters in industry and energy, they should pay for this. There's a big pot of money, because the greenhouse gas emissions are becoming increasingly expensive thanks to the functioning of the ETS. Part of that money, the income that's generated to that, should be moved to farmers, I think. And same goes with taxes. If you put a meat tax on meat, then the income that's generated should go to farmers in order to help them to make this transition.
So this is an interesting one for me as a livestock producer myself. When I look at your list of what consumers need to work on, need to change, and I like that we've got examples on sort of, we're all in this together, right? So we need agriculture to be making change, we need consumers to be making change. And one of the things you have listed on there is that, of course, we should reduce food waste. So that's a huge one, right? And that's one of those that we create so many emissions for food that never gets eaten, which is, that's one that obviously is in each individual's hand. But on one of your slides, you did mention organic production for farmers to adopt. And that one for me is as a livestock producer, organic production, where's the carbon savings in organic production?
Yeah, that's a tough discussion. So I think you cannot say in general that organic farming is good for climate change overall. But some, and it's probably not so much for livestock, but for crop production, a lot of the organic farming is very similar to climate smart farming. Because you have more carbon sequestration in that type of farming, and you don't use fertilizers, for instance, which is an important source of nitrous oxide emissions. But I agree, this is only one small piece of the puzzle. It's much broader, and livestock is, for me, livestock is the elephant in the room. That's the hot potato. I think that in crop production, I think we will be able to manage, because you can, with relatively few changes, that's what we saw in Australia. Also, all these soil carbon projects, they were really great for everybody. They led to more production, to better crops, to more resilient soils, more water retention, but more drought resistant. Everybody was happy. But livestock really needs to change. We have to reduce the number of livestock farmers, and livestock farmers have to change to crops, because we need those crops to produce our food with more than meat and dairy. But that's a huge change.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And also for the Australian context, how did they achieve the soil carbon increases using plants only? Or did they use plants only?
Yes. So the use of compost, no longer using artificial fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers, all kinds of activities were required there, which led to a larger uptake of CO2 of the soil. So soil is a big source of CO2 uptake, but intensive farming has led to a loss of CO2. So a lot of CO2 through tillage went up into the atmosphere. This can be restored. You can get this back, but you have to change your practices then. And this was actually the most interesting one. So this is also, I did a case study on this particular because I quite quickly found out that most projects were soil carbon projects. And the simple reason was that farmers saw that colleagues who adopted these practices had much greener areas, fields, much more crops. They had much less issues with, in the case of droughts. So they saw the benefits, the other benefits, not just the money that they generated, but the benefits for their business more broadly. And yeah, so that then a lot of farmers then started to do the same projects simply because they saw all these co-benefits. And that for me is a success. It should not just be the money, but it should, you really have to understand that this is really the way forward also for the future.
Now, Sarah, there's several questions in the chat I think that very much will segue in. We'll move into our Q&A now because there's several questions that I think center on exactly what you've talked about with the APF and with the environmental farm plans and these sorts of things. So I want to delve into some of these because this is one of these questions I think dovetails very nicely that, so Karen Spencer asks, the APFs have been going on for some time. Is there a measure of greenhouse gas emissions reduction for all the money spent and changes in farmer practices at all?
At the Alberta level, not necessarily, no, or at least not publicly available information when it comes to the emission reduction. We rely heavily just on the voluntary nature of best management practice adoption. And so, for example, under the climate change and energy risk area, this would just be practices such as adopting renewable energy or participating in carbon credit trading systems. But at the provincial level, we don't monitor it under these practices, or at least we don't have access to it, or at least I've never seen it, the access to this. So it more so comes from the Statistics Canada website to see the emission reductions in agriculture. But for individual practices, no, because we don't even know if farmers adopt practices with this cost share funding or if they utilize it long term. So there would be no real way to measure it as of right now.
So from a personal perspective, I'll offer this on our farm. We have accessed funding through the CAP program, through the cost share. And I will share that the application itself, not that bad. Knowing whether or not something's actually available or qualifies, that can be a bit of a hit or miss. But the only follow-up really that we had was just essentially proving that we had purchased what we said we would. And someone actually came on site to do a brief sort of overview of what we were doing. And that's sort of where it ended. So I think that, I mean, we've hit on one of the major challenges of, now this is of course a national funding, but it's cost shared and the provinces do dole it out individually and do have some say on where that money goes. But we are missing that layer, as you've identified, of following up essentially and potentially adding up some of the benefits or maybe not the benefits, which you did mention, you know, in looking at the cost benefit analysis of some of these practices, you know, when the provinces put together what's eligible, are they targeting the most bang for the buck sort of idea? We don't really know, right? Interesting. Okay, so I'll use John Bailey's question here, Sarah. How then can we motivate producers, so this builds off our last question, to move towards adopting short and long term the as yet least adopted practices you mentioned? So those ones that we're sort of behind on, this is specifically for Alberta. Do you think the US approach proves more useful given our relative lack of monitoring capacity currently?
Right. So one measure that, at least across literature or in my experience so far, one thing that producers need is a more awareness and training when it comes to these practices. There's cost share is available to them, so there is financing, there is a private benefit for them to obtain funding, but at the same time, there's also caps because it is cost shared. So producers still have to pay, say, 70 or 50% now. It's not up to 70%, it's 50 or 70% producers must pay. So if there is a financial limitation, we should probably address that first, because farmers may not see the benefit of adopting or paying this lump sum to adopt these practices if they have no real indication whether or not these practices will improve their profitability or the productivity on their land. So that's one thing. And a lot of the basically the lowest BMPs that are adopted, these are more public benefit BMPs, such as renewable energy on someone's land. I mean, it does benefit the farmer, but it's more so a benefit publicly, such as like improving air quality or reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And there's also high uptake and maintenance costs long-term that might not come from the farmer. The farmer has to pay for individually. So I think motivating going forward, one of the biggest things is going to be increasing awareness. So using extension services, providing more technical assistance and support, and ensuring that we also provide farmers like long-term when they adopt these practices, maybe a gradual program where we help them with the first implementation, as well as help them long-term and ensure that over time, these things are being properly maintained and provide them with services to properly maintain them long-term.
All right, so one more question on this before we go to some of the measurements, Jonathan, of the Australian system and that sort of stuff. But there is a comment here on the EFPs, and you identified this and that. I'm glad somebody else marked this down too, that the environmental farm plan, so here in Ontario, it's been around quite some time. It is required for all sorts of, I mean, you have to have it before you can apply for any of this funding. So the uptake, I believe, is relatively high in Ontario versus other provinces, but some other provinces don't really even have them at all. So your question then, I think, is a really good one of, you know, are EFPs, the environmental farm plan, is it effective, do you think? Why is uptake so low? And should we be moving on to some sort of other means beyond the EFP?
Right, so in the prairie provinces specifically, the EFP is quite low in the adoption rate. So most provinces developed an EFP starting in 2003 at the first agricultural policy framework, just to have it as an eligibility requirement to apply for funding. And specific to Alberta, as well as other provinces, over time it's been shown that a lot of farmers do not participate in the EFP program purely because of privacy concerns. They believe that if they identify an environmental risk on their land, that they're going to face financial penalties or fines over time, or maybe they'll go to jail for doing something wrong. But the EFP is actually highly confidential, so nobody has access to the actual workbooks that producers complete when it comes to the environmental farm plan. But as of right now, speaking when it comes to using it as an eligibility requirement, there's kind of two answers. So the one thing is that the EFP does make sure that farmers identify these environmental risks on their farm. And they do this across a multitude of environmental risk categories. And so this allows farmers to know what BMPs they should probably adopt and maybe should look at adopting on their farm. So it is kind of a tool, and they provide workshops and maintenance and help to farmers to provide this services and knowledge and expertise. But the other side is that right now we're not utilizing the EFP properly, I don't believe, for the program. Because we have access to workbooks that target specific environmental risk areas and BMPs, if we can utilize that and kind of put our cost share funding towards this targeted environmental risk areas, then over time, I think it would be more cost effective. Because right now the EFP, the government, as well as the province, can't see these workbooks and then can't target environmental risk areas. So if we do open it up, then possibly. But then that's the added aspect of now there's more privacy concerns because now the government can see producer workbooks. So there's kind of just, it's a double edged when it comes to the EFP currently. So I just think right now it's just not as efficient, but it does help producers at least understand environmental risks. Absolutely.
All right, now Jonathan, there's two questions I'm going to sort of combine into one. So this one, the question says, is the agriculture sector the best sector in terms of costs of taking action to target for greenhouse gas reductions? It could be that transportation or capital structure retrofits may be better places to consider taking significant action. And I'm going to loop that in with, there's another question about just how much emissions have been reduced under the Australian example. So maybe those two sort of tie together, right? So Jonathan, from your perspective, is agriculture the best one that we should be focused on?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with the second question because I have that figure right here. It was one of my slides. So but this is for 2016, the data that I had in my project, 143 million tons of CO2 equivalent abatement in those 630 projects. So that's not a whole lot, but it's still interesting and something to work with. And for me, I was especially interested in, does it work? What kind of rules do we need in place? And is it possible to have a system like this? And I think the answer to that was yes. But as I said, the big problem is that so far only big farms participate, and then you don't get a huge number of abatement. And then the first question, yeah, it's a very interesting question. So that's actually the reason why so far most attention of nations across the world, I think, also in Europe, has been focused on the energy production. Energy production is about 60–70% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So that's really the huge contributor to climate change. So that has to be tackled. And that is being tackled at the moment. We in Europe are in the middle of an energy transition, and that's an ongoing, that's an unstoppable train. That's really gaining speed now. And price of solar energy is dropping at a huge, tremendous rate. And it's already clear now that oil and gas are completely are no longer interesting simply because they're way too expensive compared to what we have now as alternatives. However, I also said that about 25–30% of all emissions come from agriculture and food, which means that if we want to reach net zero by 2050, then we also need to tackle that. Moreover, we also already know that some of these emissions from for instance, transport will be hard to tackle. So aircraft is still a long way far away that we have electricity run aircraft or something like that. So we will also need the sequestration potential of farms. And I think about 73% or something like that of all land that is used on the globe is land that's used by farmers, farmland. That's a huge potential for sequestration. So I think we also need farmers. So that's why I think the farming sector is very important, not just for reducing emissions, but also for the potential of sequestration. And there they should be rewarded. Therefore, they can offer humanity a way out of this crisis if they allow sequestration projects on their land. But we have to pay them for that.
Mm-hmm. Sarah, I see you nodding as well. I want to note that I graze my sheep under solar panels on a commercial site. So just so you know, livestock can do some really cool things. All right. So, but this does bring me to my next question here, which I think is a great one. And I hit on this as well. Jonathan, you did mention, of course, we would have a potential to have land that is being used for livestock production rewilded and set perhaps back into trees, these sorts of things, what would be naturally there. Now, someone is, and I have many questions about that, but we don't have a lot of time, but we see in Alberta the value of large mammal grazing in support of the original ecosystem, which of course was bison. Now that's largely been swapped out for cattle. Do you see a view that large mammals should be reduced, or do you see maybe the use of a certification system of beef in that respect? So certainly, you know, when we're talking about grasslands or talking about land bases, annual cropping actually probably isn't the best use of that land by the measure of being part of the ecosystem. Grasslands are, and they need large mammals. They need those ruminants to be healthy. So how do you see that fitting in? And that's question is for both of you, because Alberta, that's a huge, huge play as well.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. A colleague of mine is actually researching exactly this issue, also relating to the role of mammoth in creating this type of ecosystems. And you're right, I think cattle can play a role here. And also, I'm not saying that we should lose all cattle altogether. I think that the consumption and production of meat and dairy has to go down, but there has to be, it won't go away. That's unthinkable, and it's also not necessary. As you indicate, there are several reasons why we should also keep some cattle, but at the moment we simply use way too much space, especially in developing countries in tropical areas, to grow food for our animals, and that is not the way to go, simply because of space reasons, let alone the greenhouse gas emissions that are associated to that.
And Sarah, from your perspective, of course, this is a huge important factor for Alberta.
Right. I mean, the Alberta sector were very heavily tied to, especially the beef cattle industry. So in our sense, kind of reducing the livestock, it would reduce, kind of like most producers, it's going to be a huge challenge when it comes to, especially our gross domestic product that comes from agriculture for Alberta. But just to speak more so on the policy side, we do have a lot of regulations in place for beef cattle producers and just for livestock in general, such as verified beef or Dairy Farmers Pro Action Plan or Ag Farmers of Alberta. They have PEEP. And these are all variations that require, environmental farm plan. And they also monitor and have individuals come out to the farm to ensure that they're following sustainable practices. So we do have those in place, but at the same time, there is the notion that livestock does produce a large quantity of emissions, especially from anaerobic digestion. But at the current rate, I think it's more so just adopting these practices, ensuring that you're following sustainable measures, because we do have such a big tie to the cattle industry. So maybe in the future, but I don't think livestock needs to go away. There's still a demand for meat and there's still a demand for these products. And beef isn't just food. There's a lot of things that are tied into livestock and agriculture.
One last question very quickly, Jonathan. Someone wanted to follow up asking, so the work that was done in Australia in looking at that case study, greenhouse gas emissions, the reduction was measured, but was it part of the national inventory report? So basically the question is, did Australia get credit for it? Because that's a big question here in Canada as well. If farmers are doing these practices and are accumulating potentially credits or whatever, how do we actually account for it properly?
Yes, yeah, well, that's I think the strongest point, I think the biggest lesson that we can learn from the Australian system. They have completely integrated this into their climate change policy. So this is their way to reduce emissions and to show to the UNFCCC and to the Paris Agreement, to the Secretariat of the Climate Change Convention, that how they achieve the goals. So this is exactly, and this is what's missing in all other countries, including the EU. So that's why the Common Agriculture Policy is not working, because there is you have to have these projects, and they only check if you do the project, but they don't measure how much CO2 will be abated in that project. But that needs to happen. So you have to link this financing instrument to the climate change policy.
All right. Okay, we are out of time. This went so quickly. I thank you so very much to both of our speakers today for sharing their time, their expertise, their research. Thank you to all of you who asked fantastic questions and followed along. I hope this has been interesting and insightful for you as well. So thank you to both our speakers. And of course, keep an eye on your inbox. You will receive, this has been recorded, so you will receive a link to this webinar to watch again or to share. And I will also let everyone know there are some upcoming webinars, and sort of playing off of this discussion, certainly What's the Beef About Beef? That webinar goes September 22nd, 2021 at 3:30 Mountain. And then it also looks like there is a Simpson Center webinar, Strengthening Canada's Food System by Reducing Food Waste, and that runs Tuesday, September 28th at 11 a.m. Mountain. And so if you are interested in either of those, please register at www.policyschool.ca/webinars. So thank you to everyone. I'm Lyndsey Smith. This has been a wonderful, wonderful hour and super insightful. So thank you to both of our guests, and thank you to everyone else. Cheers, everyone.